I'm here to talk to you a little bit about Doc and the book that I've had the opportunity to work with Tony Mazzolini on about this historic B-29. I wish I could have brought Doc with me, actually, but it's a little tough to land that airplane over here. It's also true that I'm not even safe driving at night, so they wouldn't give me the keys to it if I could have found a place to land it. Doc has 4 engines and weighs about 120,000 pounds. That's 3 more engines and 117,000 pounds more than anything I ever flew. I'm betting it's a bit more difficult to handle than that Cessna 182 as well. By the way, that is me flying in that 182 in the bottom picture. I had my private pilot's license back then in 1977. I asked my flight instructor, Bruce Landsberg, who went on to become the president of the AOPA Safety Foundation, and then the vice chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board, if he thought I was ready for instrument training after he instructed me to the private license. And he said he heartily agreed, and he recommended that I consider the clarinet. But there are a lot of things I've learned about Doc. And in the next few minutes, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of those. The development and deployment of the B-29 bomber itself was an amazing accomplishment. It demonstrated the resilience, resourcefulness, and resolve of America's greatest generation in the face of a worldwide war. In a book I highly recommend if you're a World War II history buff, Freedom's Forge, author Arthur Herman described the B-29 as a, quote, considerable achievement, a stunning sight. 99 feet long and weighing 58 tons fully loaded. It had a 141-foot wingspan, almost half a football field. Balanced on its tricycle landing gear, its long fuselage stood nearly 30 feet high. Its 4 Wright Cyclone R3350 engines would give this gargantuan beast a cruising speed of 357 miles per hour. That's 70 miles per hour faster than the B-17 Flying Fortress. And a service ceiling of 31,000 feet, plus an unheard of at that time range of 5,330 miles. It was designed with impressive leading edge technology, including the first ever analog computerized central fire control system, turbo supercharged engines, pressurization, and the ability to carry a 20,000-pound bomb load. It also cost more than $3.1 billion to develop, about $57 billion in today's dollars. Considerably more than the Manhattan Project's $1.9 billion that was used to develop the atomic bomb. In the end, the expenditures were deemed worth it. And the Japanese fought to the bitter end to defend their home islands. Historians estimate that the additional casualties from both sides could have exceeded 5 million. Getting the airplane from concept and design into production and eventually into combat proved to be a massive challenge, one that was fraught with problems, delays, mishaps, and even tragedies, but one that also exemplified the resolve, commitment, creativity, and spirit of the American workforce. If you're familiar at all with what was called the Battle of Kansas, you know that the name actually referred to the overall development and production of the B-29, which was severely compressed. In order to meet General Hap Arnold's orders, he was the commander of the Army Air Corps, to have 150 B-29s deployed to the China-Burma-India theater by mid-April 1944, Wichita's workforce worked 10-hour days, 7 days a week. As it happened, January through April of 1944 was marked by extremely harsh, sub-zero winter days and nights. But modifications to the B-29 were coming fast and furious. The completed airframes were parked outside, on the ramps of the factory and the modification sites. And the temperatures were brutal. But to meet the push to get the B-29 into combat on schedule, Boeing's Wichita's workers put in 21 consecutive 10-hour days as the deadline loomed. Wichita Wichita was the most productive site among the 4 sites where B-29s were built. The other 3 were Renton, Washington, Omaha, Nebraska, and Marietta, Georgia. Wichita delivered 1,644 aircraft out of the 3,977 that were built during the war. To put in perspective how important Wichita was to that effort, of the 393 B-29s accepted by the Army Air Force by mid-year 1944, 310 were built in Wichita. Finding, acquiring, and returning just one of those B-29s to the air took Tony Mazzolini and Doc's friends more than 30 years, approximately 450,000 volunteer man-hours, and millions of donated dollars. There are now no other B-29 airframes remaining that could be restored to airworthiness, nor are there the many experienced workers, available facilities, or necessary parts to accomplish it either. But beginning in 1987 and continuing to this day, the story of rescuing Doc has been one of overcoming seemingly insurmountable obstacles. We've all heard the expression, in order to accomplish virtually any task, you have to mind your P's and Q's. That's why I decided to title this talk with that. It's useful as an outline because it describes both Doc's restoration and applies to writing the book too. So here are the P's we'll be minding: persistence, perseverance, patience, people, pride, and patriotism. When it comes to the Q's, I'll try to leave some time at the end for some questions. I also brought along a quantity of books in case you'd like to have one. There's copies of the books over at the table, and I'll be glad to sign them if you'd like one on the way out. I hope this talk will at least whet your appetite, even if you don't like my writing. There's some great pictures in that book. So that's another P that you can add to the P's. But let's start with the first one. Persistence is the first P on the list. As it applies to Doc, persistence could also be spelled T-O-N-Y, as in Tony Mazzolini. Let me tell you a little about him. He's a native of Ohio. His father's family immigrated to the U.S. from Tuscany at the turn of the 20th century, and Tony was born and grew up in a part of Cleveland that's still known as Little Italy. He remembers the Cleveland National air races, the war, and the presence of a lot of aviation-related industry in his hometown as he grew up during the 1930s and 40s. Tony's now 92 years old, still lives in Cleveland, and wish he could be here with you because he's still a great storyteller. Following high school, he joined the Air Force and served during the Korean conflict as a flight engineer on B-25s in Japan, and eventually flying electronic countermeasure missions in the eastern U.S. While based in New York, he also recalled landing at Griffiths Air Force Base in Rome, New York, and seeing a squadron of B-29s dubbed the Snow White Squadron. It consisted of 9 airplanes: Snow White, the Wicked Witch, and the 7 Dwarfs. That turned out to be his initial encounter with Doc, but it didn't make a huge impression on him until 30 years later, when he discovered that distinctive Disney character, Nose-Art, on the airplane he was seeking to remove from the China Lake target range. He's reluctant to say so, but in hindsight, he's awfully glad that the bomber trainees who targeted Doc weren't very active. Once he left the Air Force in 1960, he went to work at the aerospace industry at Thompson Products, which some of you may recognize as the T in TRW. From there, he joined General Electric and then Continental Airlines. As an Air Force veteran, he was actively involved in the Air National Guard, the Air Force Association, and following a memorable invitation from a celebrity entertainer, whom you may recognize, to visit his annual flying in Texas, Tony founded the Cleveland wing of the Confederate Air Force. Tony was actually there with his friend next to him, Pat O'Malley. Pat worked with him at General Electric, and it turns out that Pat and Tennessee Ernie Ford had been bombardier trainers on B-29s in New Mexico during the war. So when he found out that Tony had actually been a B-25 flight engineer, he said, "Hey, we could use you on our B-29. Tony said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, we've got one in the Confederate Air Force, it's now called the Commemorative Air Force." He said, "That airplane needs a crew, and especially trained people." So Tony ended up finding himself a member of the CAF, and he ended up founding the Cleveland wing of the Confederate Air Force. He began to look for a restorable B-29, because every one of those wings likes to have an airplane that they can use as an attraction for people to come to and to offer rides and so on. It took him half a dozen years pursuing numerous dead ends before he identified a viable candidate. It took him another 6 years to acquire it, and another couple of years to find a place and people to restore it. By the time Tony made the extremely important connection to Jeff Turner and Boeing Company in Wichita, he'd spent a small fortune and a large chunk of time just acquiring the one and only one of the potentially restorable B-29s. At that point, he was out of funds, and as he says to this day, as a 92-year-old, rapidly running out of runway. When Doc was finally delivered back to its birthplace from California on 7 flatbed trucks, the airplane itself was 56 years old. It hadn't flown in decades. It was, as one Boeing volunteer said upon seeing it for the first time, a pile of junk. But Tony wasn't about to give up on it, not even close. He wrote letters, searched numerous sites, traveled from coast to coast, built a network of support, expertise, and influence that kept the dream alive. He would get discouraged, exhausted, and even felt sometimes desperate when funds were depleted and obstacles seemed insurmountable, but he never gave in. He persevered. I point out to you at this point in time, too, you see the gentleman in the bottom photo, I'll reference him again in a minute. That picture was taken, those pictures were taken in May of 2000 when the airplane showed up. And Whitney Boyce, who you met earlier as Dave's guest, his wife was one of the people who signed on at that point in time to help with Doc and played a very important part, as did Dr. Terry Finn, and I'll reference him again in a minute. It took a lot of research, resources, and repetitive explanations to solicit help and support, to learn what he needed to do and who to talk to, and what restrictions he had to overcome, where he might find a B-29 or some usable parts, all to put together and eventually put it back in the air. He searched the Greenland ice cap. Some of you may have heard the story of Keybird, which was landed there, and finally a group went up to try and rescue it after 50 years. They actually were able to get it dug out, put it back together, got the engines running, and unfortunately they had a little auxiliary power unit they had in the back of the airplane that started the engines and ran the instruments, and it was running in the back of the airplane, just jury-rigged back there, and it got jostled as the airplane started to roll, and it tipped over into some oil, and the airplane ended up having to abort the takeoff, and the conflagration basically consumed the whole airplane. Fortunately, the crew got out, but that was a dramatic effort to get a B-29. Tony had looked at that one. He looked in jungles. He looked in lakes and oceans. There are a couple of B-29's tails that were sticking out of lakes, and then there was one in Lake Mead, believe it or not. I think it's still there. He looked on former movie sites, research sites, and several times on target ranges following up leads on B-29s. At China Lake Naval Weapons Center, where the last 2 flyable B-29s, Fifi, which is flown by the Confederate, now Commemorative Air Force in Texas, and Doc, both were found at China Lake. Tony was told on multiple occasions that there aren't any B-29s here. When he mentioned that he had seen pictures like this one of the airplanes on the desert floor and seen himself from the air, the airplanes down on the desert, he was told by the Navy brass at the base, those aren't B-29s. Those are targets. Now that's probably a little bit of a jab at the Army, Air Corps, and Air Force by the Navy, because the Navy doesn't think anything that the Air Force flies is as good as anything they fly. So they call them targets. But Tony acquired Doc eventually, but he had to comply with crazy government regulations, wait endlessly to receive bureaucratic excuses. He once wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy trying to get this airplane, and he was so incensed by the way they were treating him, not the Secretary himself, but the folks at China Lake, that he called it the burn before reading letter. It's kind of hard to make out the words after it's been burned, but anyway. He took all types of efforts to get the airplanes, and he got all kinds of excuses. And they told me really he couldn't restore this. The biggest and weirdest excuse, I think, was that the government said it'll never be legal for you to own it, A. B, to restore it, because it's considered part of the SALT Treaty. That's the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And that's because the B-29 was the platform that was used to drop nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So believe it or not, even into the 80s and 90s, Doc, which had never flown a combat mission, and other airplanes that still looked like B-29s, there are 24 in static display around the country, were considered part of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. That's obviously been preempted by now, but it literally took Tony years to move forward with the refurbishment of Doc. But he was patient, another P. That patience was severely tried, not just by government or military bureaucrats, but by the state of California. I remember the airplane was on China Lake in the Mojave Desert, had been there for 42 years. I would say that it wasn't just stretched, but I think that patience was especially stretched by the state of California. When Tony and the volunteers from the United States Aviation Museum, which he founded, were finally given permission to move it from China Lake, the Navy encouraged them to expedite the process. They obviously didn't want dozens of civilians roaming around on this highly restricted site. But the state didn't have the same sense of urgency. Instead, they informed Tony and the USAM volunteers that California required submission of an environmental plan at a cost of $28,000 to ensure that the extrication of the B-29 would not disturb the habitat of the desert tortoise, which is indigenous to the Mojave Desert. And it's on the endangered species list. The review, which took 6 months to complete, dictated that they employ 2 environmentalists at a cost of $45 an hour to walk in front of each main landing gear for 8 hours a day as the aircraft was towed from the target range to prevent any displacement or potential harm to the tortoises. Those 2 tortoise trackers added an additional expense of $3,600 and countless diversions to the operation, and turned what was a 13-mile direct trip from the target range to Inyokern Airport into a 38-mile odyssey over 5 days. You gotta love that picture, by the way. It says the highway is patrolled by aircraft. I don't think they thought they were going to be taxiing along it when they posted that. It dawns on me as I consider all of this restriction by California that it might be considered frivolous. I don't know whether you agree. The state of California was mandating that Doc's rescuers go to insane lengths to protect a species of tortoise that is so thoroughly antisocial that it spends its life burrowing into deserts, places that are almost uninhabitable by most every other organism. To top it off, California further dictated that China Lake's population of desert tortoises be afforded special consideration so that their homes, let me remind you, they were on a bombing range, not be disturbed by people moving around. In other words, the volunteers who hauled Doc out of the desert had to go to extraordinary lengths to ensure that the turtles were snug in their burrows when and if they were hit by heavy ordnance dropped from the sky. The USAM also had to find and buy a B-25, and traded to the U.S. Navy for the rights to acquire a dock. They found one owned by the Venezuelan Air Force, they bought it for $55,000, even though it was not flyable. Took it apart, put it on a ship, shipped it to the United States, only to have it in the Caribbean when Hurricane Andrew hit. Fortunately, it did not sink the boat, and the PBJ B-29 was eventually completed and presented to the Pensacola Naval Air Station Museum. That's it down at the bottom. There's a lot more to that story, but I do have some books here if you'd like to read about it. It's highly unlikely that even Tony would have had enough patience to endure 18 more years of struggles, missteps, interruptions, and billowing expenses if it hadn't been for the people that he met and worked with throughout Doc's saga. But he met so many exceptional folks during his quest to restore the B-29 to flight. That milestone, which was finally reached on July 17, 2016, 29 years after Tony first laid eyes on Doc, and 16 years after Wichita's Doc's friends began working on the airplane. That's a group that Sam's very familiar with. He knows a lot of those people and worked with them. I interviewed scores of those folks, and they all shared in the pride and patriotism that prompted their participation in Doc's restoration, and their enthusiasm and excitement when Doc took off from McConnell Air Force Base for the first time in almost 60 years. I don't know, Kathy, were you there then?
I was living in Wichita.
Okay, all right. They still feel that pride whenever Doc flies overhead, and that exhilaration is shared by thousands of attendees at air shows, fly-ins, and exhibits nationwide each summer, because that's what Doc does these days. That picture down at the bottom shows Tony with the then FAA Administrator Mike Huerta and Connie Palacios, and I'll tell you about her in a second. Tony wanted to have an official certification as a flight engineer for the B-29, even though he doesn't use it anymore. And the administrator came and gave it to him at Oshkosh the first year that Doc flew there. Some of the people that helped rescue Doc were Dr. Terry Finn. I mentioned to him earlier. He read an article in the Wall Street Journal about Doc being stranded in the Mojave Desert with no way to transport to Wichita for restoration. A NASA and Defense Department consultant and author, Dr. Finn, picked up the phone and asked Tony if he could help. He ended up donating more than $100,000 to move Doc from the West Coast to Boeing, Wichita. Jeff Turner, who had never met Tony when he returned a call to him in 1998, had a lot on his plate as the vice president and general manager of Boeing, Wichita, but his father had served in World War II, and Tony's quest resonated with him. He promised him, if you can get the airplane to Wichita, we'll help you get it back in the air. And he did. Then there's Jim Murphy. He's up there in the upper left in the red shirt. He took on the job of being kind of the general manager, restoration project manager, and ran in addition to his own job at Boeing. And then there's Dan Wimberly in the blue shirt next to Jim, who was, he's an extraordinary guy. He could make tools for anything. He could just fabricate just about anything. And he was with a friend of his watching on South Oliver when the trucks showed up with the airplane. And his friend said, you know, they're going to get you involved in that. He goes, I wouldn't go near that mess on a bet. Well, the next day, they came to him and said, we can't get the landing gear off the truck because it's been put on there by somebody that didn't give us a tool to get it off. So Dan made the tool on the first day, and he was, and is still involved in it. And it cost him a steak dinner at Mike's Steakhouse in Wichita. Connie Palacios, you see her up there in the right. She was 18 years old when she came to Wichita to work on a line at Boeing. She's one of the original Rosie the Riveters, and she's 100 years old as of January this year. She still shows up at the hangar sometimes on Tuesday mornings to greet people, and she likes to wear that outfit. Marvin Martin next to Connie, and Charles Chauncey, who's in the lower left in the B-29 cap. That's the lower right, actually. They both flew on B-29s. They were sources of a lot of information and great stories. Frank Berry, who's right below Connie, son of Fred Berry, who I had hoped would be able to be here today, but Frank is the official kind of historian, and he has a wealth of knowledge about Doc. He's the one who said when they got it here, he was talking to the press, and he said, yeah, they brought it to us here on 7 flatbed trucks, and then we disassembled it. So you can imagine how much they had to do to get this airplane back in the air. This group was awarded the Wichita Aero Club trophy, and thousands of volunteers worked with them. There were so many that were key. I can mention a lot of other names. Their enthusiasm sometimes caused concern. When we had people who were 80 years old up on the top of the airplane, we made a rule that said, if you're older than the airplane, you can't climb on top of it. They had a great deal of pride. Whenever Doc surpassed a major milestone, they'd have a party. Whitney, we were talking about that. Whitney's wife would make all kinds of cake. They'd have pizzas. They'd have donated food and so on. It was a great thing. One of the most memorable events was the construction and occupation of Doc's Hangar, Education and Visitor Center at Wichita's Dwight D. Eisenhower National Airport. I should turn the mic over to Sam now to tell you all about that, but I won't, because I think I'm out of time. Doc's Hangar has turned into a tremendous venue for in events as well. It's not only a home to the airplane, it does have hundreds of other people visiting it. I think there's some right now, according to Whitney, I think his kids or grandkids are going out there. There are lots of recollections of divine intervention. I could go into those details, they're in the book, but for instance, the drawings didn't exist anymore for the engineering, and they suddenly came up. Doc has the only set of drawings that's available. And the Doc's mission is to honor, educate, and connect. I'd like to tell you that Doc's nose was an interesting example too. A guy that was 85 years old painted that on it. He'd done that during the war. This is a picture of Doc on a runway, and it was a labor of love for Tony to create the process and to get this airplane into the air. And this whole story was a bucket list of his. He wanted a book, so that's how I got involved. It's been a tremendous experience and one I wouldn't trade for anything. I want to close with an interesting thing that Mac, one of the pilots told me that General MacArthur said at the end of the war, he sent out this message, and in light of current events, it's certainly pertinent. He said, today the guns are silent, a great tragedy is ended, a great victory has been won, the skies no longer rain death, and the sea bears no only commerce, and men everywhere walk upright in the sunlight. The entire world is at peace, the holy mission has been completed. Then he concluded with a deep and ominous truth. He said, we have had our last chance. If we do not devise some greater and more equitable system, Armageddon will be at our door. The problem basically is theological and involves a spiritual recrudescence and improvement of human character that will synchronize with our almost matchless advances in science, art, literature, and all materials and cultural developments of the past 2,000 years. It must be of the Spirit if we are to save the flesh. So it looks like General MacArthur was prescient. He was talking about pursuing peace. That's 3 more P's we can mine. And so it's definitely time to go to the Q's. I don't think we have enough time for questions. I'll be glad to answer some afterwards. But the other Q is for quit, so I think I will.